All right, I have started recording.
Okay, I was just going to remind you.
Thank you, and let me let everyone in.
Okay.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are going to wait just a couple minutes here just to give stragglers a chance to arrive. But it looks like we have a good group here, 51 people so far. So we'll get started in just a moment. Let me just say a couple words before we do. My name is Benjamin Ward. I'm one of the product managers on the Lightroom team. If there's anybody here who this is your first time attending this group, welcome. So happy to have you. Do these once a month. They used to be in person at the San Francisco Adobe office. Now, obviously, we're not doing that, but it makes it easier for anybody to attend who wants to attend. So I'm doing when we do them online here. And we have a variety of different topics and presenters, try to get a really diverse number of topics and so on. So sometimes there are Lightroom tutorials and how-tos. Sometimes, like tonight, we're going to learn about a photographer's work and their approach to the art of photography. So lots of different stuff, and always happy to hear what you guys are interested in as well. So tonight's presentation, we have Jennifer Renwick, nature photographer. Super happy to have her here with us tonight, and I am personally very excited to hear this presentation. Jennifer's presentation will go about an hour or so, and we'll have a little extra time at the end for questions. The chat pod is active. I don't know what the interface looks like for you guys, but I'm sure you're all Zoom pros by this time. You should see a chat button somewhere. So if you have questions, you can post them in the chat pod. If they seem particularly urgent, I will interrupt Jennifer to ask them. Otherwise, I'll hold them to the end and I'll relay them to Jennifer at the end of her presentation. And having said all that, I think we're probably ready to get started. Jennifer, let me turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Ben, for having me, and hello to everyone out there, and thank you for joining us. Do you want me to go ahead and share my screen and start?
Yeah, sure thing.
Okay. Okay, how does that look?
Looking good. I can see
Okay.
your one slide in presenter view.
Okay, good, but not the notes.
Correct, not the notes.
Okay, perfect.
At least that's my view of it. I don't see the notes.
Yes, no, that's good. That should be.
Okay.
All right, so I'll go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone. Good evening. So my name is Jennifer Renwick. Today I'm going to be talking about a topic near and dear to my heart, which is about telling stories in our nature photography. I'll share how some of these techniques have helped me create more fulfilling imagery and how it has enhanced my vision for my own photography. So thank you for joining us, and I hope to give you some ideas to work with that you can take with you out in the field tomorrow, if so. And thank you again to Ben and the Lightroom User Group for having me present tonight. So I'm just going to go into a little bit just about me real quick to kind of familiarize you guys with me. I'm originally from Illinois, and I have a background in geology and veterinary medicine. I was a hobby photographer for about 3 years and have now been doing it full-time for about 4. So in total, about 7 years. So after a life change, I took a break from my job. I met David, my business partner and my boyfriend, who actually spoke with you guys, I think, last month on some Lightroom stuff. And I hit the road full-time with him to pursue photography full-time and to teach. We currently travel in a 4-season travel trailer around the American West, teaching workshops and photographing. Our home base is Golden, Colorado, and we are back here every few months or so. Living on the road has really allowed us to connect and get to know places intimately, so then we can then share that with our students and on our workshops. It's also enhanced our own photography for the better, as the more you get to know a location, the more you connect with it photographically. So this May marked 4 years of traveling full-time. Living in such a small space can be challenging, but we make it work. We like to joke, we haven't left each other on a street corner yet, so I'd call that a win for 4 years. We've also traveled with our two cats who you can see on the screen. That's Kona and Maui. And for cats, they actually enjoy traveling as much as we do. They act more like dogs. So obviously, given what's been going on in the world, the last few months, we abandoned our travel schedule. So we've been here in Golden working on projects and sharing meetings and teaching through Zoom and trying to figure out what to do the next few months, as I'm sure a lot of us are in these uncertain times. So together, David and I are exploring exposure. We teach landscape photography workshops throughout the West and provide educational resources like ebooks, tutorials, and articles. We are also the owners of the Nature Photographers Network, which is an online community of nature photographers that offers image sharing, image critiques, educational resources, socializing, and just general camaraderie. We're also the co-founders of the Nature First photography movement, along with 7 other Colorado nature photographers. Nature First is dedicated to how we can be good stewards to the land that we love and photograph. And it includes principles to follow when shooting to kind of help protect these places that we're photographing. We saw a disturbing trend happening to a lot of our locations that we were photographing, especially here in Colorado. Everything from people leaving behind trash to harassing wildlife to trampling tundra and wildflowers to get a shot and so forth. So together we need to all be good stewards to the lands that we photograph so we can ensure the next generation of photographers get to experience these beautiful and wild places as well. So before we start, kind of a disclaimer, this is a huge topic and there's no way to hit on everything in an hour. So I'm not diving too deep into composition, even though I'm touching on it a little in a segment along with a discussion on color theory. The info I'm presenting is based on my observations and things I've learned throughout my own journey. The examples I use, the concepts I'm talking about are not the end-all be-all, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm sharing my experiences and distilling them down into pieces that you can kind of grab and take out into the field to help you right now. I enjoy sharing my journey, and we all have our own journeys. That's what makes this craft so fulfilling and exciting, and how we learn from each other. So I'm going to explain my photographic style briefly. My photography focuses on the smaller details and scenes in nature. Having a background in geology and veterinary medicine, it's made me very perceptive of details and observing the natural world. Animals can't talk to you and the earth can't tell you how it formed, so both fields rely on observations. And that's a key component to how I interact with nature. I find and photograph the smaller moments and the smaller stories in the land and the details. I really enjoy photographing natural abstracts, smaller scenes, working in black and white, and the occasional grand landscape. So you'll see a lot of those examples here tonight. So some objectives for the next hour. So I'm going to go over why tell a story with our photography, some techniques for storytelling, and curating photo projects, which is a great way to tell stories. So why tell a story? So humans have been expressing themselves with artwork for thousands of years. Even cave paintings tell a story. We're visual creatures by nature, so we're drawn to these expressions. Landscape painters told stories with their paintings. We as photographers follow in their footsteps. Paintings were an important asset in setting aside these magical places for future national parks. They needed to convey a story to individuals in Congress that couldn't see it for themselves. So in a way, this is how we use our photography. We want to convey a message or a feeling to the viewer of our photograph. Storytelling can show them something that they were not able to see in person. So storytelling is an invitation from yourself to the viewer of your photo. And what you're asking them to do is take a step inside that photo with you. So the best photographs tell a story rather than just a recording of a scene. It's more than just a pretty photo when you're sharing a story or a feeling. Unlike a snapshot, sometimes we want to capture an image that elicits an emotional response from the viewer. It may be an emotion that we were feeling at the time or a representation of an emotion the image reminds us of. Maybe it's a story of a quieter, peaceful moment that we'd like to remember. This is a quiet little scene from a remote dune field in Death Valley National Park, and I'll be sharing the story behind this image a little bit later. Or maybe it's an exciting moment that we're caught up in. This is an example of what it's like to be in the Zion Narrows, standing in cold, rushing water, chasing the glow throughout the canyon. Or maybe we just want to document something cool we see. Like I said earlier, I love natural abstracts. This is one of my favorite. This is just a unique little mud pattern on a playa in Death Valley. But whatever it is that compels us, we only have a few seconds to capture the viewer's attention. So how do we tell these stories? I like this quote from Elliot Porter. He says, "Photographs are believed more than words. Thus, they can be used persuasively to show people who have never taken the trouble to look what is there." So he's a personal photography hero of mine, as he did a lot of small scenes work, and some people claim that he's, the grandfather of the smaller scene. And those are something that I'm personally drawn to. But I really enjoy this quote because it's very true, and it perfectly describes what our imagery is capable of. So why tell a story? We've all heard that a photo is worth 1,000 words. That means with one photo, you can convey so many different things. Storytelling is a great way to capture the viewer's attention in a sea full of photos. I think I remember the fact from a few months ago that I saw that there are 95 million photos uploaded to social media every day. And even if you're not on social media, there are still many, many photos out there. So telling a story instead of just sharing a snapshot helps photos relate with the viewer and stand out in that sea of photos. We might want to tell a story about what we were feeling when we took the photo. We might want to tell the story of our subject in the landscape. We might want to convey a message, perhaps about conservation and protecting the environment with our photos. Creating art that invites viewers to ask questions and connect is what we want. It keeps them in our frame longer, which is our ultimate goal with our photography. So how do we start? We need to find the story and identify the subject. We can use compositional elements, subjects, elements of the scene, how we frame a scene, and even colors can be used to tell a story. We can express ourselves in our photography or use metaphors with our subjects as to how we were feeling or how we related to the subject. And finally, photo projects are an excellent way to tell a story when one photo quite isn't enough. So we're going to start off with finding and identifying the subject. With photography and storytelling, we usually think of photojournalism. While there are some commonalities between landscape photography and photojournalism, they are still a bit different. We all remember learning how to write stories in elementary school and following the who, the what, the where, the when, and the why. To translate that into nature photography, the who is usually the subject. The what could be an action that the subject is doing or something that is occurring, a moment or something that makes the location unique. The where is about giving a sense of place to an image. And the when could be viewed as a timed event such as the seasons or a weather event happening. So each of these would be considered examples. So now I'll share some examples in the following slide to give you guys kind of an idea. So let's start out with my little bear friend here. So we're going to start with the who. So here it's pretty obvious what the subject is. This grizzly bear kind of has a whimsical look on his face. He was feasting on huckleberries, and from the foliage around him, you might discern that it's autumn with the colors starting to change. I purposely centered him because he was the main subject. I liked how he was sitting in this patch of huckleberries, and although there were mountains behind him, I didn't want them to distract from the story, so I left them out and just centered on him. If you wanted to tell the story of this bear and his environment, you very well could have included the mountains, but I wanted my subject pretty clear. If I had included the mountains, you may not have taken time to notice the huckleberries in front of him, and it would have taken away from his story. On the other hand, maybe you wanted to tell the story of where this bear lives, which is in the mountains. There's no right or wrong, it just comes down to personal decisions. So in this example, the who is the rain and the sunlit storm. I included some elements such as the mountains for scale and the trees in the foreground to kind of give a sense of space. I didn't zoom in on anything particular because I wanted to tell this whole story like it was. I could have zoomed in on Wild Goose Island there in the middle, which is that little island that you see there, but I would have lost the context of the storm, and the viewer would be wondering where the colors were coming from. So here, it's easy to see what's causing the colorful rain because I have included the source of the sunset in the sky. So think of these things as you identify your subject and the story you would like to share. So just a note, if This is your story, just a colorful scene, that's totally fine. That's the beautiful thing about photography. It's an art form. So whatever you want to share is totally fine. This is not about being right or wrong tonight. It's just about sharing ideas and hopefully kind of getting that little wheel turning in your head about how to tell stories and, give you some inspiration. So going back to that, I could have zoomed in on Wild Goose Island there in the middle, but I would have lost the context. So the viewer might be wondering, why is the water orange? They don't see the storm, but maybe you want to be a bit abstract and you like the zoomed in look. It's all subjective because it's your personal view and your story. So if you think of these things as you're identifying your subject for the story you want to share, make that decision if you're going to use a telephoto lens to isolate or a wide angle lens if the scene is the whole story. So let's move on to the what. In this example, the what is the action of the water spilling over the rocks here on the coast. I captured the motion using a slower shutter speed to enhance the direction and the flow of the water. So here you can see I made it my main subject. In this example, the what is the steam rising above this geyser basin. This is Norris Geyser Basin in Yellowstone National Park. It's one of my favorite geyser basins out of the whole park. And I enjoyed on this morning how the steam was rising up and the sun was also rising and it illuminated the steam. So the moment of steam represents the what. So let's think about where. In this example, the where is the sense of place. So with a sense of place, I want the viewer to feel like they're in the photo with me. So here I purposely left the sky out to accentuate the high walls of the canyon and slowed the shutter speed down to smooth the water to kind of create that peaceful feeling. So here I wanted someone to look at this photo and, really kind of feel this is what it feels like to be in the Narrows. And I could have also said my subject was the two cottonwood trees that you see here kind of lit by the sun. There are actually a few things going on in this photo, but for the most part, I just wanted the viewer to kind of get that feeling and sense of place. So another example of where. Sometimes it's about what makes the place unique. Here, it's the geology that makes this slot canyon a beautiful subject by itself. It has unique textures and lines, and you can see a little bit of glow at the top. So what makes this location unique? The geology and the fact that it's a slot canyon. So that's a perfect example of where. And now moving on to when. So like I said earlier, when could be a season or it could mean a certain weather condition. Here, there are two combined, making up the subject. So we have autumn and we have some snow. This was actually the first snowstorm of the season and it arrived pretty early. This is in Crested Butte, Colorado. So the aspens were still lit up with gold and the snow just created a perfect mix of two seasons. Another example of when, I mentioned storms earlier. So this is a storm occurring over the Teton Range. So the bottom line to identifying your subject is to distill the scene in front of you to determine what to tell. Some subjects are straightforward, as we've seen in a few examples, such as documenting a storm or the coming of another season, such as autumn. And remember, it's okay if the story is just a pretty scene. Don't think too hard, just kind of let the subjects come to you. So compositional elements. So compositional elements, I'm sure this is a review for many of you, kind of help direct you to tell a story or express a feeling about a scene. These include colors, shapes, lines, perspective, framing, and isolating. Your visual choices and how you place these elements help the viewer see or feel the story. This could be a very in-depth subject, so I'm just going to run through some examples demonstrating this. So back here to our canyon rush example. So here I wanted to make the viewer feel like they were sitting in that river with me as I photographed. It was very cold, although I can't relate that feeling to them. I just wanted to put them as close to the river as I possibly could. So I used a lower angle on my tripod and I used a wider angle lens. And I used the shapes and the flow of the river to help achieve that. So using these compositional elements to help draw the viewer in and guide the viewer to a subject is exactly what we want to do. So here I wanted to frame my image. So the subject was the tree, which you can see kind of in the back of the canyon, and the steep walls of the canyon, and I wanted to include that glow. So I wanted the viewer to feel the same thing I did when I was standing in that river. So like I said, I lowered my tripod, I got a little closer down and used a wider perspective. And I used these compositional elements to help tell the story. So you can see we've got a nice triangle here with the rushing water, kind of forms a triangular pattern. And you can see the lines. So there's nice flow through the image, and it leads you ultimately, your eye, back to the glow of the canyon and the little tree back there. So it makes your eye kind of follow the river all the way around. In this example, I used the composition to convey the large amount of negative space around this leaf to add to kind of a solitary feeling. The leaf is all alone in this maze of sandstone striations, and this leaf was far away from trees, so I was left wondering how he arrived there. I composed this purposely using the negative space around the leaf to communicate that isolation. So I've got my little leaf here down on the bottom, and you can see I use the negative space that kind of leads your eye out from that, kind of, you know, making that feeling of isolation very real. And no, I did not put the leaf there. That's usually a question I get. He was there on the rock, I swear. So here, this is an example of, again, getting down lower to your subject. I used a lower wide angle shot to kind of be on the rock's level. I wanted to convey the power of the waves as they rushed over the rock. I wanted the viewer to appreciate kind of how much this rock takes a thrashing from the waves on a daily basis. So I got down a little lower, and you can see here, so we have those flow lines kind of heading toward us, which is the water. And we have a lot of pressure from our eye to travel up from the bottom of the scene to kind of meet up to the rock. So both forces kind of joining make you focus on that rock, and being lower kind of gives you that feeling of being thrashed by the waves. So, you know, use those compositional elements to tell a story. And I tell my students this all the time, you know, don't be afraid to break those elements up into shapes and, you know, colors, you know, take it back to elementary school, because those shapes are what kind of guide our eye. So here in this scene, I see two trees and I see a lot of lines from the trunks. So I have one tree here, I've got one tree on the right side, and they both make kind of a triangle shape, and then I can appreciate the lines coming down from the trunks in the rest of the frame. So the interesting story about this one was we had a few really windy days in the San Juan Mountains, and we went back out to photograph a few days later, and this hillside had been covered in aspens. And when we went back 3 days later, the wind had just demolished the trees. And I saw this one aspen that didn't look like he had been bothered at all, and one fir tree, which obviously doesn't lose his needles. And I just found this little story very interesting. You know, it reminded me that they were kind of facing each other, kind of looking around going, you know, like, what happened? So I titled it Survivors. And, you know, those two compositional elements, even though it's made up of really two things, tell a powerful story. So here's another example. So here the subject is the morning sun and the nice warm glow that it's, you know, casting on this field of wildflowers. So immediately the elements that stand out to me are the trunks back here, and we've got these nice lines coming in, kind of like the shade of the trunks leading diagonally back to the source of the picture, which is the sun and that morning glow. And I created a sun star just by stopping down my aperture and kind of lining it up against a trunk and getting that sun star. So to get those sun stars, you usually have to be anywhere between f16 on some lenses, but mostly f18 to f22. It all depends on the diaphragm in your lenses. Canons and Sonys make really nice sun stars. Nikons are okay. I have a Nikon, so nothing against Nikon, but they're not as exciting as the Canon sun stars. So here's another example. This is a little simpler. So when I saw this scene, so this is another picture from Colorado, and this was right after, again, an early snowstorm, and the sun was just breaking, and the snow had just left a nice dusting of snow on the trees. And you can see in there, you can see some aspens that are still golden that haven't even quite turned yet. And immediately my eye went down there to the two little trees in the corner. And to me, it looked like they were, you know, watching the storm clear and kind of like watching the new snowfall, but they just reminded me of a little audience just watching this theatrical performance of the atmosphere clearing. So this is a pretty simple one. I mean, I could say, you know, I've got a diagonal line coming in from the left and your eye kind of travels around the trees. But really for me, it was about just grabbing those two little trees in the corner and telling a story. So colors. That's our next thing up here in composition. I'm going to touch briefly on colors. So colors are a compositional element, and they can help us convey feelings. So think carefully about your color choice, as color can create and imply certain feelings or emotions. Understanding color theory can help you create more compelling imagery. So we associate certain colors with emotions, and using them in pleasing ways can convey feelings. So for instance, using like complementary colors creates harmony and just a visually pleasing effect to our eyes. So here, this image was just all about color, and I thought it was a perfect slide to use for our intro into colors. So what you're looking at here is a patch of natural oils from the desert. So these form in areas along a riverbank or puddles in the fall, and what happens is leaves and other organic debris kind of settle in the puddles, and as they decay and break down, this organic matter actually just leaves behind an actual oil slick. So this was taken with a macro lens. This area was probably only about like 3 inches by 3 inches. So yeah, you can see I was using my macro lens at 40 millimeters. Just creates really fun patterns. And I haven't enhanced the colors at all on this. They really are that colorful. They're pretty fun to see and kind of crazy. And I'll have more on oils actually at the end of the presentation. So colors, I know this might be kind of remedial and a refresher for you guys, but just bear with me. So using the right color combination can create a more visually appealing image. Colors can also be used to convey certain feelings, create visual interest, and make certain elements in a photo pop. So analogous colors are colors that sit right next to each other on the color wheel. So we've got our yellows and greens, our oranges and reds, our purples and blues, and then back to blues and greens. Complementary colors are colors that are across the color wheel from each other. So think blue-orange, purple-yellow, and red-green. So red, I'll just run through briefly kind of what colors remind us of. So reds are usually energy, excitement, passion, and anger. Oranges can be warmth, happiness, enthusiasm. Yellow are always cheerful, also happiness, and sometimes they represent a little bit of friendliness. Greens are calm. They make us think of hope and renewal, fertility, growth. Blues are usually, more cold. They can, represent sadness. They can also be very calming and tranquil. Purples represent mystery, kind of royalty, and pinks are usually calming and gentle. So for example, this is Mammoth Hot Springs in Yellowstone National Park, and this was photographed kind of right a little before the sun came up, so you kind of have that nice twilight glow going on. And here you can see these soft pastels of pink, yellow, and blue, and they kind of create just a harmonious feeling. And it kind of detracts away. We have a dead tree there in the center, and it's very angular and harsh, but the colors kind of overwhelm that and still give this kind of a peaceful feeling. So I'm gonna look at the chat real quick here if I can see it, because I have a question to throw out to you guys. So how does this image make you guys feel? I don't know if I can actually see the chat. Maybe Ben, you can shout out what people are typing in. So give me like 1 or 2 words that make you, what does this photo represent to you guys?
Hey everybody, time to chime in. Fresh. I think that's a great one. That's not what occurred to me initially, but that is a great one. Magic. Fantasy, storybook, bucolic.
Perfect.
Green,
all right.
Cheerful. New life phase.
Hey, so right there, you guys have listed off a lot of what the green represents. And what's funny is that that's exactly what I was feeling when I stumbled upon this scene. So I named this one Fairy Tale Stream. This is from deep in the wilderness in Colorado on a backpacking trip. And we stumbled upon this stream, and with the waterfall and the sun and the wildflowers and just slowing down my shutter speed to create kind of that dreamy feeling to the water, I really thought, this is just like a fairy tale. And don't tell David, but I was half expecting like a prince on a white horse to like cross the river in front of me on his way to like go slay a dragon or something. It was just really, it was a real surreal scene. But when I show this image often, those are pretty much the same reactions that I get from everybody. And it's, you know, it's the green, it's the warm from the sun, and the blue in the stream. And it does represent just kind of that, you know, fresh growth, hope, renewal, fantasy, kind of like the things you guys were talking about. So perfect. And kind of leading into that, we've got this little bunch of flowers. We've got the Tetons in the background and another sun star. So this photo generally represents, you know, happiness and blissfulness, because the blue and the yellow color combination is very pleasing to our eyes and just elicits that feeling of happiness. And what's funny is when, you know, if you talk to photographers that sell their work at art shows, or they're stock photographers, you know, a lot of the photos that we think would sell, you know, as photographers, you know, we're always chasing that dramatic light, or, you know, those amazing clouds, and, you know, oh, look at this weather scenario over the canyon. And we think, you know, that's what people want on their walls. Well, it is true to an extent, but what they'll tell you is that pictures like this will sell over those pictures any day. And it's because people love that blue sky and yellow flower combo. It just immediately creates feelings of happiness and contentness. So it's one of those, you know, wacky facts that you would never think, you know, oh, well, I would think some beautiful Grand Canyon shot with a clearing storm and lightning, but people are really attracted to scenes like this. So just something to think of if you sell your work, or you know, maybe you are on the art fair circuit and you can, you know, agree with me, but that's just what I've heard from a lot of my friends who sell their work, that people are truly attracted to scenes like this with those colors. So also take the time to look for those complementary colors as well. So for instance, in this photo from Death Valley, we've got a little bit of blue, we've got some yellow orange. So blue and yellow are a favorite color combination of mine to work with. It actually enhances compositions. These are pretty easy to find in the landscape when you have warm highlights and blue shadows together. They also help create dimensionality for our 2D images. Remember, we're taking a 3D scene and making them 2D in our camera. So having these color contrasts really helps. So this image conveys just a very soothing feeling. And for anyone who's curious, the blue sand dunes, so this was taken like right after the sun disappeared behind the mountains for sunset, and there was a sandstorm going on, and the atmosphere was just full of sand, and it was reflecting that sunset light. But the blue dunes are actually the result of the dunes reflecting the blue sky. So you get this really amazing color combo. This was actually photographed on a clear blue sky day. And I'm a big proponent that there's many things to shoot on days with blue skies. You just have to open your mind a little bit. But Death Valley has, you know, surfaces like salt playas, sand dunes, mud, even the Badlands to an extent. You know, they're all made up of minerals. And these minerals actually capture the light. So if you have a sunset over a salt playa, it usually reflects whatever color is going on in the sky, as do the dunes. So just kind of a little fun fact about Death Valley, and to maybe look for that if you're ever out there again. So purples and yellows, this is another very good complementary color combination. So the interesting thing about this little story was last fall, David and I were in Yellowstone National Park, and we had about 4 to 5 days of complete blue skies. So we ventured out anyway and made the best of it. And we were coming back on the boardwalk, and we noticed that the sky was this very unique purple. And we had seen it a few nights previous too. And we thought, you know, what's going on? That's so weird, but beautiful. So we went home and went to trusty Google and kind of looked it up. And when we looked it up, so, you know, there were news articles on this. So last fall, there were 2 volcanoes erupting. I think one in Siberia, one in Russia. And when volcanoes erupt, they release aerosols up into the stratosphere. So these aerosols scatter blue light. And when they mix with the red and the pinks at sunrise or sunset, it creates this purple hue, because when you mix red with blue, you get purple. So we were able to witness this for a few nights, and it was just a really cool phenomenon. And we got Old Faithful erupting at the same time. So it's one of my favorite pictures, actually, and I just love that combination of purple and yellow. So if you see on the news there's a volcano reacting, exploding, erupting, I'll get the word right eventually, I'm a geologist too, how shameful. If you see on the news that one of these things is, you know, erupting, maybe head outside and you might actually catch this one night or in the early morning. So like I said, blues and oranges are complementary, and in this picture, they give this water a nice, soft, pleasing feel. combined with a slower shutter speed. So if you're wondering, the orange in this picture is actually the canyon walls reflecting, so the sun is hitting the canyon walls and that light is reflecting into the river. And it's creating the patches of orange. And the blue is the sky reflecting. So it's really fun, and you don't always notice these colors when the river is running full strength. You usually have to slow down your shutter speed. So here it's about 1/4 of a second. I enjoy shutter speeds of about 1/4 of a second. Or so, because I find that keeps that nice soft look, but you also retain that texture, which is important to me because with the texture you get the colors. So next time you're playing with water, try 1/4 second and see if you enjoy the results. But it's a setting that I have found over the years just makes my water look pretty good. So this image would elicit, this has a lot of blues in it. So this might elicit some feelings of calmness or tranquility, or maybe even sadness. And when I photographed this, I was leaning towards a little bit more of sadness. And then these beams of light broke through the clouds. And I almost thought, okay, now it's sadness kind of turning into hope. So use your colors to represent those emotions. And then back to our Glacier National Park photo. So this has a bunch of pinks and oranges and even a little bit of purple in the shadows. Yellow from the sun. So this is a very exciting image. So we tend to look at these colors and we, kind of get excited and passionate and, ooh, what's going on here? So it's an exciting picture because of the colors. So next we're going to go on to isolating subjects in our scene. So this is a big part of storytelling. The subject is what we want the viewer to focus on. We want to direct the viewer to, what we want to focus on. And then, sometimes the viewer will fill in the rest with their feelings and perceptions. So we can use a different lens, wide versus telephoto, use the light and weather conditions to highlight a subject. So here we have the lower falls in Yellowstone National Park, a very commonly photographed scene. This was last fall, and we arrived probably about 2 p.m. and it was a clear blue sky day. And the sun was highlighting not the steam, but the mist coming up from the base of the waterfall. And I liked the way it was traveling behind these trees. So I decided to play with the scene. Now, while this scene is pretty nice in itself, I wanted to dive a little deeper. So here you can see I isolated 2 subjects. The first subject that I isolated was the mist rising behind this rocky outcrop full of these pine trees. And then below we have my favorite tree. Yes, I'm a nerd. I have a favorite tree. My little tree in Yellowstone National Park, I should really give him a name because I love him. But this tree just caught my attention, and he's on a rocky outcrop all by himself. There are no other trees around because the trees in the top photo are quite above him. And I just, it invited me to ask, how did he get there? Why is he there? Why are there no other trees around him? So ultimately I focused on that tree, and that was the story I wanted to tell. So I went back a few days later, a little earlier in the day around noon. So I didn't have quite that orange glow from the afternoon sun. It was a little more white light, and I just waited for the mist to kind of rise into a pleasing pattern behind him, and I told his story. So I've named this Forsaken because, like I explained, I don't know how the tree got there. I kind of feel bad for him. He's by himself, and maybe he feels forsaken, kind of left on this cliff. So in a few slides, we'll get into using metaphors and anthropomorphizing, which I do a ton in my photography. So let's go back to the same picture of the falls. So this is spring. This was actually earlier this year, and we have a rainbow. Now, this is a pretty scene in and of itself. And again, I kind of wanted to, kind of scope around with my telephoto lens and see what else I could isolate, because I knew that there were some smaller stories in here. So I went ahead and I focused down here on the base of the falls where the rainbow was forming, because I noticed something very interesting going on. So I noticed these birds, and as you can see, there are 2 in the frame. So these are what are known as violet-green swallows. And what they do, we'll go back here, they reside in the cliffs here along the waterfall. And what they were doing was they were zooming into the scene, excuse me, collecting insects on the fly. And they were doing some amazing aerial acrobatics. They were just fascinating to watch. And the background of the rainbow mist just really added to this photo. So I went from a very commonly photographed place, and I found my own little unique story just by taking out that telephoto and trying to isolate some stories and, look for those subjects. So this was the final picture, and I named it Serendipity because it was a happy finding that I wasn't expecting that day. So let's get away from Yellowstone and head back to Colorado. So this photo in and of itself is very, it's very pleasing. You've got some blues, you've got some yellows. I love these aspens, and this is Mount Sneffels near Ridgway, Colorado. And there was a storm clearing. So when I arrived, I kind of waited to see what the storm would do. And, I love this little scene. I love the way the aspens are lit up and they look very golden, but I knew that there were other stories to tell. So if you could travel out of the photo, if you kind of went about a quarter mile, half a mile around, the road kind of bends around. So then you're looking at the stand of aspen full on. So I traveled over there and used my telephoto lens. And right before the sun disappeared behind the mountain, I caught this moment of light with this stand of aspens. And to me, it seemed to be telling the story kind of like they were stepping into the light. It just looked, kind of like they were an audience even, kind of watching the sun go away. But I zoomed in even further. So if you can kind of look in on the stand of aspen, and I ended up shooting this right after twilight. So I really appreciated the way the leaves kind of looked like they were falling off of this grouping of leaves. But if you look closely, they're actually still aspen leaves attached to the branches. But I really enjoyed how they were kind of scattered on the base of these leaves. And anytime you shoot aspen trees kind of in a twilight, you really get a nice glow. So out of that one scene, I came away with these 3 little scenes and 3 little stories. So another part of composition is perspective. You can use perspective to draw attention to what the focus of your story is. Even a simple move like moving your tripod up or down, or even taking a step to the right or the left can change the story. So for example, here we've got a salt playa in Death Valley, and you can see that some of the water is flooding on the playa behind. So the first image, I have my tripod fully extended and I've got a nice wide expansive view. You can see the flooding, you can see that there are dry parts beyond the flooding. I've kind of, you can see those salt patterns, those nice circular patterns. But then I took my tripod down to about middle. And now you can see we kind of lose some of the depth in the background. We can still see it's flooded, but we're kind of losing that perspective. But we've also, zoomed in a little bit more on these interesting salt circles. If I go down even lower, we've lost some of the salt circles, but now there's texture. And I don't know if you can notice, but there are actually little bird footprints in that texture near the bottom of the screen or the bottom of the photo. And, you definitely lose, the flooding in the background, but, all 3 of these kind of tell a unique story. So don't be afraid, to use your tripod. What I notice a lot when I'm out shooting and I see other people out shooting is, people will rush onto a scene, they'll set up their tripod, and then they don't move for like an hour and a half. So always, always play with your tripod, go from low to high, and, use those different perspectives, because it can really shine a new photographic opportunity that you didn't notice before. And so, you can also use your, perspective to draw attention to what you want the focus of your story to be. So here, this is a dried lake bed from Anza Borrego State Park in California. So on the left, I've got that more expansive view, my tripod's up a bit higher. And then the photo on the left, I've gone down a little bit lower because all of a sudden now I see that this is morning, by the way. The light is not only hitting the mountains, but I've got these beautiful little highlights on my mud tiles. So I wanted to put my tripod down lower to appreciate those. And one thing you always have to keep in mind too are distractions, because if it doesn't add to your photo or story, you generally want to get rid of it. So here's some lilies from, I think they're lilies. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. It's been a long time since I photographed this. Yeah, I think they're lilies. They're in Northern California, but here you can see I've set up a nice shot with these flowers kind of leading to the background. But in the first image, you can see there's one little flower that's kind of cut off. So I had a decision to make. Did I want to do that and maybe Photoshop him out, or just move my camera back and actually include him and find out that he actually adds to the photo? I'm sorry, I'm calling it a he. It's just the first thing that came to mind. So always be aware of these distracting elements in your photography. If it doesn't add to the story, try to get rid of it. And I know that you can get rid of things in post-processing, but sometimes it can be a bit challenging. So I'd rather try to get it as close to right in the field before I head to post-processing. So here's an example from Grand Prismatic Spring in Yellowstone National Park. You know, so in the corner there, I kind of have, I don't know if you guys can actually see it on your computer, but I've got some little birds. They were these very cool little skinny-legged birds. I used to know what they were. I just looked them up a few months ago when I was processing these, and now the name escapes me. But they're kind of hanging out here in this little thermal feature. Now they're interesting, but I don't like that big gray kind of area coming down in my corner. I kind of feel like it detracts from the scene. So I simply just zoomed in a little tighter. I got rid of the little birds. I gave them their glory shot a few shots later, much better shot. But I got rid of them in this scene. So always, you know, kind of be aware of these elements that can actually retract from your photo. And if it doesn't add to the story, get rid of it. So here, this is Valley of Fire. This was sunset, setting on an arch. And you can see in the first photo, I've got some bushes, I've got a wash down there, just some kind of details that are in the shadow and hard to see. So I made the decision, I'm just going to eliminate them completely because the story is really more about the arch and the light. So in the next photo, you can see I used that telephoto and I zoomed in on that arch, and it's, you know, once again, we've got that blue and that orange, that nice color contrast, and it just made for a better photo. You can also use depth of field to enhance your subjects and kind of show your viewer what you want them to focus on. So here, this is from Balboa Park in San Diego. We've got this nice cactus and we've got some little succulents at the base of the cactus. So in the first photo, I've kept everything in focus. But then later I determined, you know what, I really like this little bunch of succulents on the right side, so I'm gonna draw most of my attention towards them. So what I did was I have to think about this, yes, I decreased my aperture and I made the ones in the background a little bit blurry because the real story to me were the succulents on the right side. So don't be afraid to play with your aperture, you know, create that, you know, bokeh effect, you know, really zoom in or zoom out on what you want to focus on. So another example, this little glacial lily. So this was in Crested Butte. This was a whole meadow filled with these guys. And while the photo on the left is, you know, it's pretty interesting, you know, there's a ton of little flowers. I didn't really care for that big rock there. And I also decided, you know what, I just want to focus on one of these flowers because I want to appreciate, you know, all their little intricate parts, the petal. And so I zoomed in on one glacier lily and I, you know, made my background nice and blurry just to put all the focus on that flower. So while both pictures, they're, you know, they work, I really wanted, you know, my story, what I wanted to pick out of that picture on the left was just one glacial lily. So don't be afraid to play with aperture either. And then the last part of this composition, the compositional elements that help is framing. So framing with natural elements can also direct the viewer's eye to where you want them to go. So you can use fences for this, tree trunks. Here I kind of used 2 tree trunks to kind of frame this nice little scene. It was right after a snow and autumn in the San Juan Mountains. And you can see the aspens being highlighted by the sun back there. So I decided to frame them and the mountains with this little stand of pine trees. And one parting note, as we're going through composition, when you're telling your story, try not to get sucked into the rules too much. You know, you might be trying to tell a story where your subject is centered, you know, that's perfectly fine. You know, rules kind of box in creativity. I always tell my students it's really good to learn the rules when you're starting out, just to get those fundamentals, but try not to let them influence, you know, your stories too much. Sometimes, you know, a story where you are following the rule of thirds can actually make it a little boring. But if you take that subject and move it off the, you know, off of the third, and you've got something else going on, like some interesting light, it can make a very pretty photo. So try not to, you know, get too technical here. You know, you're telling a story, you're kind of playing around in your mind too. So don't let the rules kind of box you in. They're good to keep in mind, they're good to know, but try not to let them rule your thinking. I had to, I mean, the door was open on that one. So personal expression. This is by far my favorite way of telling a story through my photography. So when we use personal expression, you know, we're using our feelings, and we all have feelings, and some of us may not always be comfortable sharing our feelings or our emotions verbally, but we can through our imagery. So I like to use, like I said earlier, metaphors, and I like to anthropomorphize my subjects. So when you use a metaphor, it's a figure of speech that describes an object or an action in a way that isn't literally true, but helps explain an idea or make a comparison. Anthropomorphizing is when you attribute human characteristics or behavior to an animal or object. Both of these concepts help us connect to our subjects, therefore making it a little bit more personal. And that leads us into making it personal. The more personal you are, the more people connect with your imagery. Making it personal makes it relatable. So I like this quote from Peter Adams. This is, "Great photography is about depth of feeling, not depth of field." So don't take that literally. Of course, photography is about, depth of field and technical things. But what he's trying to get across is that, remember, a picture can be worth 1,000 words. Really try to emanate your feelings through that, because we are the visual storytellers with our photos, and it's our job to tell the story and present it to the viewer in an impactful way. So this is an example of using a metaphor. So this was a very rare morning in Death Valley a few years ago. We had had a whole night of rain, and in the morning, these badlands were soaking wet, and the sun actually came out to clear the storm and dry things, and it created this fog and this mist. And it just made a very eerie feeling, but it was so cool to see. So to me, the mist rising off the wet badlands almost looked like spirits or ghosts. And I couldn't help but think maybe they were the ghosts of miners. Don't be afraid to use your imagination, because sometimes that forms the story in your head. And just for a little background info, these badlands are where they used to mine a lot of the borax. So, I let my mind kind of wander, and I thought, maybe this is the ghosts of miners past. And I actually created a series with these images. And the mood that I kind of wanted to portray with this is, mysterious, maybe some intriguing, kind of spooky, and processing it in black and white really helped get those moods across. Another example from Death Valley, this is an example of anthropomorphizing. So in the middle of the dune here, or kind of at the crux, you'll see a little bush. This is a creosote bush. They're very common in the desert, and they're all over Death Valley. And this was during a sandstorm. So I was out here, the winds were howling. It was probably 40 to 50 mile per hour wind gusts and probably 30 mile per hour sustained. It was pretty rough, but those conditions make amazing conditions on the dunes. And if you're brave enough with your gear, which I'll just come out and say it, I've been shooting dunes for 4 years in sandstorms. I head right out as soon as I hear, the winds are coming, and I see that on my weather app, and I've never had a problem with my camera. I don't change lenses. I just don't put my bag down, and I, dedicate myself to one lens and just go out there. But the sand is actually blowing around kind of like shin level down on your legs. So it's really not so bad. I wear contacts, so I obviously go out there with goggles, and my boyfriend and I will go out there with masks on. I have asthma, so I just try to not breathe in the fine particulates, but it's a really amazing time on the dunes. So anyway, so this little creosote bush is out in the middle of the sandstorm, and the first things that kind of came to me were, maybe the dunes are protecting him. He's kind of tucked away in that little crux. This is a very harsh world, and maybe he feels alone and isolated. So I wanted to convey those feelings with this image. So I kind of, I gave the bush human attributes to make it more personal. Another example of anthropomorphizing. These are trees in Yellowstone National Park. This is winter, so what happens is you'll see these trees in the thermal, or in the basins around the geothermal features. So here he was kind of near a hot spring. It's out of the frame. But what happens is the steam over the winter constantly barrages these branches on the trees. They freeze, they melt, they refreeze, the steam coats them with more layers, and then of course you get the snowfall during the winter, so the snow kind of piles up and it forms something that's called rime ice. And these trees are just covered in it. They almost look like winter statues. So this tree, to me, when I came upon him, the tree right in the front, he just looks exhausted. He looks burdened. This is heavy ice. The tree isn't really exhausted because, he doesn't have feelings, but to me, it looked like he was very burdened and exhausted. So I named this picture Exhausted. So this photo might conjure up feelings of despair, exhaustion, burdened, tired, maybe hopeful because the sun is shining. Maybe today is the day that the sun will shine and kind of break those chains of ice. So it's all, you know, perception, but, you know, don't be afraid to anthropomorphize your subjects. Again, it just makes it more personal. So you can also use metaphors. So, and you'll notice all these pictures, most of them are from Yellowstone and Death Valley. They're the places where we spend most of our time. And as a geologist, I can't get enough of Yellowstone. It's like my Disney World. So these thermal abstracts are just so fun to work with. And when I came upon this one, it immediately reminded me of reptile skin. So there I'm kind of taking, you know, knowledge from my past working in veterinary medicine and working with reptiles. And, you know, it kind of clicked in my brain, you know, that's what that reminds me of. So don't be afraid to even take things out of your ordinary life that, you know, you can relate to in your photography. So, you know, the colors are enhanced here only by a polarizer. They're really this bright, especially during the day when the sun is shining. I just used my telephoto lens to isolate these little patterns, but it was a pretty fun find. So another metaphor, this is from Grand Teton National Park. This was actually a puddle in the campground where we were staying. I went off on an evening walk one night, I came across this, and what you're seeing is the pollen from the trees settling in this puddle. And when the puddle kind of sloshes around, it creates these mesmerizing patterns. So again, with my background in geology, to me, it looked like a topographic map. So that's what I named it. And it was pretty cool to see. Another example of this is a ponderosa tree from Yosemite National Park. And, you know, right off the bat, you know, it reminded me of layers. You kind of see the depressions in the bark and you see some yellow and blue. And just a side note, so I photographed this about almost an hour after the sun had set. A tiny little longer exposure really brings out those twilight blues. Now the bark wouldn't look like this during the day. It's got a little more gray tone to it, but twilight really brought out those colors. And with the depressions and the different layers, it reminded me of, you know, lamina. So, you know, compressed layers on top of each other, and, you know, some of them look like they're eroding away. Another fun one from Death Valley, I named this Desert Cocktail. This is actually a tiny little puddle on a playa, and those are actually salt crystals floating around. So right off the bat, it reminded me of some kind of fun little drink. It was also like 80 degrees. I was hot, so, you know, it sounded good. But yeah, these were pretty fascinating too, and I took this with my macro lens. And it's hard to tell, but they were floating and isolated in a watery solution. And the last part of this is, you know, don't be afraid to, you know, relate your own experiences in life through your photography. So this photo, Promise of a New Day, this was taken in Death Valley a few years ago. And I had a mother, unfortunately, with a terminal illness at the time. And this was I spent most of my time taking care of her and working. I'm an only child. So, you know, I wanted to take care of her. And I was able to sneak away to Death Valley for a quick little getaway. And I had just received a phone call that, you know, she had been put back in the hospital and things just weren't going well. And I was super stressed. So I went out to photograph because nature is part of my therapy. And I went out and I saw this little sun star, you know, I lined it up on the edge of the dune, saw the sun star happening in my live view, and I photographed it. I enjoyed the cooler tones, very peaceful, kind of cooler colors. And it just reminded me that, you know, every day the sun sets and the next day is a new day. So things will get better. So that's a personal story that I can attach to this. Now, I understand that if you just saw this, you wouldn't know that story. So a lot of times I attach writing and captions to my imagery to kind of help guide the viewer to what I want them to see, as in this case. So this story also has a lot of personal meaning to me. So this was taken on a beach. It was during one of the worst creative slumps that I've had in my 4 years doing this full time. You know, it can be very hard to be creative all the time. So I just didn't feel like shooting. I had no interest in photography. So David and I went for a walk on a beach one evening. And this was about, you know, I hadn't picked up a camera in about a month at this point. And one thing I like to tell people is when you're in your ruts, don't lose your contact with nature, you know, still get out there and hike and take walks, you know, without your gear. And, you know, you still want to maintain that relationship. So that's what I was doing. And I noticed it was a very stormy season. It was winter. And when these waves retreated from the shore, or retreated from the sand, they were leaving these amazing patterns behind, and I hadn't seen anything like it. And I saw this and I got super excited, and I said, oh my gosh, I have to come back and shoot this. Like all of a sudden I had that, spark for, photography again. So I came back the next night, and luckily, it was high tide and these patterns were still being left behind. So I photographed it, and I called it apparitions because they reminded me kind of like of the ghosts, and maybe the, non-creative ghosts that have been haunting me for a few weeks. So you wouldn't understand that just looking at this picture, but in this case, I always include my little story behind that to kind of help the viewer see. So don't be afraid to include text with your pictures. Anything that you can do to kind of help guide the viewer to kind of better understand how you were feeling is always a good idea. So the last part of this, photography projects. This is probably my favorite thing to talk about. Photography projects are wonderful for sharing stories and feelings, and they help exercise our photographer brains. So they're a great way to not only grow your photography, but they always keep you inspired, and they challenge you to grow as a photographer. They keep me inspired, and I always have one in my catalog that I'm curating. They are a way to experiment with new stories and ideas and challenge you to think outside the box. Sometimes one image isn't enough to tell the story or show a theme. So projects can collectively tell a story through multiple photos. They can tell a story or follow a theme. You can make a project to showcase maybe a newly learned technique, for example. Maybe you're working with black and white or macro photography. They can showcase something that you're passionate about. Another idea is to document something that you love. Maybe you have a favorite tree that you want to photograph, my tree. And you want to document how it looks maybe in each season. Projects give you a sense of accomplishment, and they keep you motivated. And you can also, like I said earlier, add writing to a project to give even more meaning and depth to the idea. So I'm just going to breeze through a few of my projects just to share with you to kind of see how I curate them. So one last show. This is from Zion National Park. So here are those oils again, and here are actual examples of the leaves decaying in the oils. So I wanted to tell a story about the leaves. I felt that one image alone wouldn't quite tell the whole story. So I photographed a collection of images. So the theme of this project is that there is beauty in death sometimes. These leaves fall from their trees in the autumn after showcasing their colors. So they've been super colorful for a few weeks, and now it's the end of their time and they're falling. They die, they fall off into these puddles, but they still create beauty even on the ground. And they produce these oils as a result of their decay. So even in death, they've created a colorful autumn, and they still leave their color and beauty behind. So this is an example of a project that has a theme and tells a story. So back to my trees, I mentioned that I don't know if I mentioned it, but I did make a collection out of this, and I named it Winter Statues. So like I explained, that rye mice, I just kind of wanted to give these trees some human attributes. So each picture is kind of named for what I felt they represented. So in the first image, they were maroon. That's a thermal feature in front of them. So it kind of looks like they're stuck on this island. I liked the way in the second picture, these trees were kind of coming out of the steam, kind of emerging with their new fresh coats of ice. There's my exhausted tree again. The one on the far right, I call gatekeepers because it's, we've got these two prominent coated trees and the steam's kind of coming through. So it's kind of like they're keeping watch on the gate, determining how much steam to let in. The picture on the bottom left, face off, there's a big, plume of steam kind of facing this tree. It kind of looks like they're, having a face off. And then in the last picture, there's just a few little trees that are really coated in ice, kind of sitting in front of what I call adult trees. So I named it Future Generation. So here's my thermal abstracts collection again. This showcases something that I'm passionate about. Yellowstone combines my love of abstract photography with my love of geology. So I just really wanted to showcase the colors and the textures, and I put them into a project. So this is a project, an example of a project with a theme and something that I'm passionate about. This is just a simple little project I called Blue Textures. So each picture in here represents a different texture. So we've got some mud, some wet mud, we've got dry mud, we've got ice crystals, and we've got salt crystals from Death Valley. And they all have that same commonality of a blue theme. So I stuck them into a little project. And this is this is an example of a project with a theme. And out of all the projects that I've put together, this one has the most deep personal meaning to me. So I've named this A Morning with Dolphins with a play on the word morning. So I know it's not a landscape, but I wanted to add it here as an example of a personal project. So back in 2017, my mother lost her battle with that incredibly cruel terminal illness. And like expected, I was devastated and numb. We flew back to Illinois for the funeral, and when we came back to California, David wanted to get me out of the desert. Random fact, we were actually in Death Valley when I got the call that she passed away, so totally like ironic in a sad way. So he wanted to get me out of there. So we headed to the southern coast of California, and I had never been there before. And when we were there, he suggested we go whale watching. The ocean was something my mother introduced me to at a young age. I come from a family of scuba divers, and we had a lot of time in the ocean together spent with dolphins and, sharks and stingrays growing up. So it was something that we were both passionate about and a love that we shared. And we had that common bond. So we went out there and we encountered these dolphins. I did bring my camera with me to photograph the whales, and we found a pod of dolphins when we were out. And as I was watching them swim with the boat, I immediately felt something. I had a vision of a project, dedicated to her. I wanted to process the dolphins in black and white, as black and white played to the depth of the emotions that I was struggling with. The black and white represented a range of these emotions. Some days after, when you're mourning the loss of a loved one, you've got those really black days where you just feel like you're in a hole and you feel hopeless, all the way to the white, which represents, you have a little bit more hope. Maybe you're coming to terms with the death, and then you've got all those gray tones in between. So that's how I felt. And that's why I processed them in black and white. So I wanted to play on the human emotions of dolphins too. They form very close family bonds, just like we do. And, I saw this happening in my head as a project, and it was a project that I was never even going to share with the world. I was just going to keep it personal. And then David encouraged me to share it. So we ended up going out 8 more times the 2 weeks we were there, because I had to bring this to fruition. So these are photographed from the bow of a boat with a telephoto lens. The ocean has to be super calm, super clear to get these photos. I know some of them kind of look like underwater photos, but they were all photographed from the boat. And now we go back every winter to California, and I continually add to this project. So it's just a good example of a project that combines something I'm passionate about and something very personal to me. And it's something that I now have continued on for a few years. 2 more examples. So I've got this water in the desert project. So you can tell I'm obsessed with mud. It's one of my favorite things to photograph. It sounds silly, but we all have our thing. So these were all photographed during different times in the winter after some flash floods. So all the minerals in the rocks around Death Valley will, come together during the flood. And when they dry, they leave behind these wonderful colors and textures. So I wanted to show with this project that even in a dry, harsh environment, water still shapes the landscape and brings life to these once barren lands. And lastly, we can all relate to this project. I named this Quarantine Ice. This was a project that came to me as I was going out to get the mail one day here in Denver a few weeks ago. Well, I say a few weeks ago, but it was actually months ago. We had been having snowstorms followed by warmer periods. This was right after, everything kind of shut down and people were in their safe at home or stay at home phases. And I noticed these little patches of ice, and, it inspired me. I hadn't picked up my camera in about a month since being home. So I thought, I'm going to go out and shoot these. So before I knew it, I had a nice little project going. So even in quarantine, you can have these aha moments. And this project may not be everyone's cup of tea, but it represents what photo projects should be. And that's personal. So this project, has meaning to me because it was the first time I was motivated to pick up my camera in quite a while during a pretty bleak time. Patterns and abstracts make me happy. So photographing that brings us joy is our fuel for creativity during these times. So now I challenge you to go out and find a project to shoot. Whether it's from files that you already have on your hard drive or something that you can go out and shoot now. Shoot, like I said, some ideas are shoot maybe a favorite tree that you have in your neighborhood, or, photograph a hobby that you love outside of photography. Projects don't have to be from far away exotic places. As long as there's something you enjoy shooting, or they represent something to you, or are just fun to shoot, the sky is the limit, and you should go off and do it. So if you enjoy these little projects, I encourage you to pick up and look at the Seeing in Sixes books. So these are published by Lenswork magazine, which is an incredibly inspiring magazine about the creative process. And they put out these 4 books a few years ago, and they're compilations of these 6 image projects. And you'll see every genre of photography represented. So there's nature photography, there's architecture, there's black and white, there's photos and colors, there's nature. There are 4 books total, all filled with 56 image projects and writings. I've had the honor of being published in 3 of these books, and I still to this day flip through each one just to admire all the wonderful work in there because it's so inspiring. The 2016 book, I believe, is sold out, a client told me, but you can still find some copies on Amazon, and the rest of the 3 from 2017 to 2019 are still in stock on their website. So if photo projects are something that you've got an interest in, I encourage you to pick up these books. They're just wonderful. So final thoughts, go ahead out there and, make your story with your photography. Take that chance, or, take that dare and, be a little bit creative, tell your story. Don't be afraid to get personal and share your feelings. Use those compositional elements to help tell your story, and just, challenge yourself to try this. Once I started putting my own feelings and emotions into my photography, it just started coming so much easier to me. So the more you practice it and head out there, it'll just come to you. So I encourage you to get out there and practice some of these things that we've gone over today. And if you want to find more of my work and connect with me, my voice is starting to go, I'm so sorry. You can find me at jenniferrenwick.com. A caveat to that, I am currently switching website platforms. It's been a very long process. It should be up and running in 2 weeks. You can go there now, and it's my old website, but there are some broken links. I'm so embarrassed. And it's not very updated. So in about 2 to 3 weeks, my new one will be up there. You can find me at exploringexposure.com. That's where David and I have all of our workshop offerings and ebooks and tutorials and just articles. You can find me at the Nature Photographers Network, and you can find me on Instagram at jennifer.renwick.photography. And if you have a mud obsession like I do, every Monday I feature photos on my story from people that have tagged Mud Monday on a mud photo. So it could be a natural abstract, a small scene, a grand scene, anything with mud. I love featuring the creativity and just, sharing people's photos. So if that's something you're interested in, just tag Mud Monday and I'll feature them in a story. And with that, thank you for listening. Hopefully I didn't put anyone to sleep, and I'm more than happy to take questions.
Hey, Jennifer, thank you so much. This was great. First off, let me say lots of positive comments in the chat. I don't know if you've been following it, but
no, I couldn't see.
Folks, thank you for showing us all this and sharing your passion, and lots of great comments about striking images and creativity. And so lots of great feedback in there. Also lots of questions.
Thank you, everyone.
So we have about 17 minutes, and we'll see if we can get through some of these questions. So let me see what I've got on the list here. Some of them are very specific and technical, and others of them are much kind of broader and more sort of speak to the sort of creative aspects. So let me start with a very specific one. For some of those long exposure ones that you do where you're blurring water and so on, do you use a neutral density filter?
The only time I'll get out my neutral density filter is if it's during the day and I've, for some reason I'm shooting in really bright light. But generally I try to look for the water that's kind of in the shade. So that example from Zion National Park with the orange and the blue, that was actually photographed. The water was in the shade, but it was still reflecting from the other side of the canyon. So I didn't need to put a filter on for that. But generally, unless it's, really harsh during the day and I'm doing some dramatic black and white, I generally don't do my water with a filter unless I just can't stop down enough to create that effect.
Great. Someone was asking, this is a pretty broad question, but somebody was asking about the slow photography movement. And is that something you can speak to at all and describe a bit?
Yes, so I'm very excited to be part of the slow photography movement. It was started by a guy in Minnesota named Ernesto Ruiz, and he invited me to be on it about 3 years ago now, when he had this idea of just this, method of just kind of going out, with no expectations and connecting with the landscape and just kind of slowing down. So I like to, I usually have a slide in my presentation when I'm talking about slow photography that shows like all these photographers like rushing out to grab, the sunset before, the light goes away. And slow photography is more about just kind of heading out, more contemplative photography, and just really connecting with the landscape around you. So the slow photography movement website, they're also on Instagram, kind of features, that kind of method of photography. We've got a lot of articles. I'm a full-time contributor there. I've written a few articles for them. We've got Beth Young, Optimal Focus Photography, who also writes for us. And, we just share our journeys in the landscape and, kind of ideas that we have along the way. So if it's something that you're interested in, definitely go visit the slowphotographymovement.com, and you'll kind of see all sorts of different viewpoints. And if you're on Instagram, we currently run a few different little challenges and projects to kind of feature the work on the website. So right now we're doing one that's called #NoBadLight. And the challenge is to go out and photograph in light that you may not usually photograph in. So midday harsh light, working with black and white even, maybe working with shade or clouds. And if you just use that hashtag on Instagram, we're gonna compile, all the images and pick some to feature on the website. And we just extended the deadline for that, I think, till September 31st to give people more time, because we were getting so many submissions in. But yeah, I just encourage you to check it out. It's just a fun place to go to get a different perspective on nature photography. And I know I saw that someone mentioned it in the comments there, so yeah.
Yeah. I feel like this next question maybe kind of ties into that a little bit. And I'll just read this question as it was written. Can you ask Jennifer for tips on how she prepares to go to these places and be there at the right times? I'm assuming not all of it is just happened to be there. Does being on the road give her a small edge to be at the right place at the right time over most people? For more hobby photographers, how can we better plan to be somewhere to get a good photograph?
So there's two parts to this that I'll answer. So I would say, I honestly, if you ask me right now, I rarely go out with a plan. I've become a lot more methodical, and I really preach a lot on not having expectations, because they sometimes lead to frustration. On the other hand, yes, I do sometimes, I will put myself out there if I do see something is happening. David and I do a lot of time just spending, or that's not proper. We spend a lot of time out there just studying weather patterns and seeing how light interacts in certain situations. And a lot of it does come from being on the road. So for instance, we spend 2 to 3 months in Death Valley every winter. We teach with the Natural History Association down there, and we run our own workshops there. So having spent all that time in Death Valley, we're a little more in tune to, we know, like, if it's raining, we know that this playa is going to flood, and, you're going to get great mud patterns. Or we know that there's a chance of, fog in the Badlands if, we've gotten a full night of rain. So that really helps us. So getting out there and just learning the landscape and studying weather patterns, you do not have to be a meteorologist. We use the app called Windy, WINDY. And that tells us everything from the ocean tides, when we're out in California, to the forecast, to fog predictions, to a lot of things. It's a very useful app. I know it's on iPhone and Android. So I would highly suggest picking that up, because that really predicts a lot of the weather for us, and then we can put ourselves out there. But a lot of the mud, a lot of just these smaller moments that I photographed really just come from my own wanderings out in the landscape. I head out almost every day when we're on the road. I don't really pay a lot of attention to expectations in my head. I don't have any. And I just find that by keeping a more of an open mind, you're in tune to see those little moments better. But then going back, in the moments that we do see an interesting storm rolling in and we check the forecast, we've just learned where to put ourselves by studying the forecast, studying how the light and the storms interact with the landscape. For example, in Tetons, we know that if you have a storm in Grand Teton National Park, and it's, you know, coming in from the west and there's, you know, a clear space behind it and you've got the sun setting, it creates really dreamy looks over the mountains. So we've just come to know that over the years. So a lot of it is just getting to know the landscape you're shooting, but also just learning to read weather, and having that app Windy really helps. And a lot of the times just heading out without expectations and just kind of seeing what you find.
Awesome. There's a question, do you ever shoot landscapes in black and white?
Oh, I do. And you know, interestingly enough, for as much as I do, I really didn't include many in this presentation. I think it was just because I had so many other things to tell. But yes, I love working in black and white. My favorite black and white subjects are obviously the dolphins, and sand dunes lend themselves beautifully to black and white subjects. So I really enjoy photographing that. When my website's up in about 2 weeks, I'll have a whole tab dedicated to different types of landscapes in black and white. But it's definitely, you know, I was very inspired by Ansel Adams, you know, growing up. And, you know, he was a big inspiration into why I like working with black and white.
And how many images do you have in a typical project?
I have anywhere from about 5 to 10, and there's really no limit. I mean, a project could be 3 images if it tells the story. You know, you may want to have upwards up to 6. I think I just have 6 in my brain from participating in those books from Lenswork the last few years. But I also have projects that I continually add to, so I've got 20 photos in there. My mud collection grows every year, as do the dolphins. So there's really no set number. I think it's just more focused on, you know, how many images you feel you need to kind of collectively add or tell the story.
Great. Speaking of the dolphins, there was a question,
Mhm.
could you repeat the technique on how you photographed the dolphins again?
So I just photograph them from the bow of a boat. I've got a private captain friend in around San Diego, so we head out every winter. But the ocean has to be super calm, super clear, and you know, you have to have the sunlight so you can get that fast shutter speed, and that's pretty much it. There's, you know, I've had the fortune of, you know, working with dolphins a lot in my life, you know, swimming with wild dolphins, studying dolphins. So I've learned, you know, kind of their movements, kind of how to predict their behavior. So a lot of it is, you know, just watching and photographing. And when I come back from one of those shoots, I mean, I will have anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 images. And out of that number, maybe 6 are keepers. So
I
as,
think
you
that
know,
just I think that just answered one of our other questions, which was
yeah,
how many shots does it typically take you to get the 6 good ones? So did I hear
yeah, it's,
2,500?
yeah, anywhere from that to, like, I think last winter I came back with 5,000 and I kept maybe 4. So it's challenging. It's not an easy project, but it's, you know, it's personal and it's well worth it to me. And, you know, it combines my love of dolphins with, you know, something that means something to me. But yeah, it's, you know, just like wildlife photography, you know, it's hard. You spray and you pray sometimes, and you never know. And I have tons where I thought my focus was just right and it's a beautiful image, but everything's out of focus except for, like, you know, a bubble or a splash of the water. So it's hard. It's definitely not something easy. And I don't head out on a boat and go, oh, I'm going to come back with, you know, 100 amazing images today. And, you know, sometimes the dolphins don't even show up, you know, that's happened too. And, you know, that's just nature, you know, it's never a given, which makes it just, you know, that much more exciting when you do get something.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, these are really beautiful.
Thank you.
Um, there's a question on this. I think this is a really interesting question. Have you ever tried showing the same photo with different titles? For example, one sad and one funny, to see how people react differently.
You know, I haven't. And I like the psychology of that. That's a very
Mhm.
interesting idea. Yeah. Thank you for that
Um,
suggestion. That's definitely
yeah.
food. That's food for thought. That'd be a nice
Um,
little experiment.
right? Yeah. You need a control group and all right. Yeah. Um, someone was asking about the sun stars. You talked about them and how certain lenses are better than others. Did the sun stars in your shots, were those with Nikon or were those with some other camera or lens?
They were. So I think I showed 2 or 3. One of them was with, actually it wasn't, I shoot with a Nikon D500 and a D750, or actually no, not anymore, a 600, sorry. And the lens I was using, the wide angle lens that I have, I believe for one of the Sunstars, it was the Sunstar with the flowers in front and the trees. That was shot with my Tokina 11-20. That makes beautiful Sunstars. And it's a nice, cheaper little lens. I've had it for 4 years. Just because I haven't been happy with what Nikon's come out for their crop sensor cameras for a wider angle. So if you're looking for a cheaper option, it's a phenomenal lens for the price. It's super sharp. I've had 0 problems with it, and it makes pretty nice Sunstars. The Sunstar on the sand dune, and I think there was one other one I shot. That was with my Nikon 28-300, which is the lens that pretty much stays on my camera most of the time. I just enjoy the range that I get with that, and it's pretty sharp. And it doesn't do a bad job at Sunstars. But by far the front runners in Sunstars are definitely Canon and Sony lenses.
Cool. There's another question of a sort of technical nature. Someone interested in why you sometimes raise the ISO if you don't necessarily have to. Like, I think you were shooting on tripod most of the time, so you could have kept the ISO at base ISO. Why do you choose to raise it sometimes?
So in some of my photos, if you saw like 500 or 250, some of the dolphins might even be at 1,000. So when I'm working with the dolphins, I've set my auto or my ISO to auto just so I don't have to worry about it. So the camera reads the light and determines what I need to get the shot and the shutter speed and the aperture that I'm going for. So in that case, I'll just let the camera decide. Other times, if you've seen like the higher ISOs in some of my shots, a lot of it is, it's a shame to admit this, but sometimes I don't always use my tripod. Sometimes I find the tripod limiting because I feel like I'm stuck in that one spot. So I like to handhold my camera a lot, and I'm stubborn. David gives me a hard time about this all the time, but sometimes when it's getting a little dark, I'm stubborn and I'm like, oh, I can just get this. I'm just gonna boost my ISO. So a few of those images, that's probably what was going on. And, I'm human. Sometimes it's, I was shooting something, last evening in the dark and I had to raise my ISO to 500, and the next day I completely forget to change it. It happens. But really there's no set reason why. Those would probably, any 3 of those reasons would be why it might be a little higher on some of my shots.
So you said you studied geology, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and somebody was asking, do you think about geology when you're shooting? Does thinking about, in addition to photographic composition, are you thinking about science and rock formation? And does that influence your storytelling?
Oh, absolutely. Especially in Death Valley. Death Valley is a living textbook example of a lot of geologic forces. You've got alluvial fans, you've got the mud cracks, you've got erosion, you've got deposition. Some of the canyons have very intriguing basement rocks. So some of the oldest rock that you can see that's, folded, and you get the gneisses and the granites that are super colorful and have really cool textures. So, when I'm photographing, let's say I'm photographing sandstone, I'll depend on my geology a lot to kind of, think of the features of sandstone. So sandstone is very unique in the fact that you can find this cross-bedding, and it's this really cool pattern where, it demonstrates, kind of which way the wind was blowing when that particular area of sand was deposited, and you kind of get diagonal lines going every which way. Those make really cool abstract photos. So when I'm shooting sandstone, I kind of know to look for those. When I know that there's a lot of volcanic or igneous rock, I tend to try to see if, I can't find those gneisses and granites, because those make really fun abstracts too, because the rock is swirled, and it's these really cool patterns. But yeah, and kind of using my knowledge that, it's not really geology knowledge, but, I spent a lot of time in college studying ancient mud cracks. So anytime there's a flash flood and I know that, I've given it a few days to dry in Death Valley, I know to go look for those. So yeah, I definitely, I enjoy using my geology skills, when I am photographing. Sometimes it guides my camera to what I want to photograph, and other times it gives me an idea like, oh, I've got some sandstone here, I'm going to go look for this feature. And it's helpful because on our workshops, you know, David kind of calls me our, you know, staff naturalist, because with the veterinary background and the geology background, I'm able to kind of give our clients, you know, a little history about the areas that we're shooting and how they came to be. So it's fun to use.
Right. Well, we have officially 30 seconds left.
Oh no.
That'd be just enough time for me to give a wrap up and thank everyone. Instead, I'm going to throw out the last 4 questions that people asked, and you
Okay.
can you can answer them each in like 8 seconds, or answer
Okay.
one of them, or whatever you want to do. So I'm just going to put them
Okay.
all out there. Any word on Mammoth Oktoberfest this year? Have you ever been to
Um,
the Sea of Cortez to photograph whales and dolphins? Which web hosting platform did you switch from and to? And sorry, one more. This last one, I think, could be interpreted in any one of 50 ways. So I'll just say it as it was written.
okay.
What do you do with your images?
Okay. Mammoth Photography Fest, I can say no. That's a long story. Sea of Cortez, no, I have not been there yet, but it's definitely on my bucket list. I switched from, oh my gosh, now I'm Squarespace. I use Squarespace. I've used Zenfolio, Squarespace, and I tried SmugMug. There were various reasons on why I didn't like either one. So now I've switched to Wide Range Galleries, which is run by Jack Brower here in Colorado. He does an amazing job. It's widerangegalleries.com. And what was the last question?
And the very last question, what might be too broad and vague to
Oh, what do I
answer,
do
the
with my
question was,
photos?
what do you do with your images? Yeah.
I put them on my website and I share them with the world. I'm not too like print oriented, but if people want to print, I'm always happy to get it to them. But mostly it's just about sharing my journey and how I interpret the world, and putting them into photo projects. If
This
that's
was
short enough.
really, really fantastic. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Oh,
And thank you to everybody who attended tonight. If you had a question that we didn't have time to answer, please feel free to message me directly through Meetup, and I will relay your question to Jennifer. And
yes. And
again, I really appreciate it.
I didn't throw my email up there, which I totally should have. It's Jennifer at exploringexposure.com. I'm sure Ben can put that in there too, but you know, please email me. I love questions. I love, you know, interacting with everyone. And even if you have like a photo project you want to share, you know, please send it my way. And I just love seeing that stuff. And thank you for all the questions and all the kind feedback and comments. This was really fun to do for you guys, and I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Thank you again, Jennifer. And thank you everybody for coming tonight, and have a good night.
All right. Thanks. Everyone
Thanks,
stay safe.
everyone. Bye-bye.